April 30th, 1975. Saigon is falling. On a rooftop, the last American helicopters are lifting people out of the city. Down in the streets, tanks of the Liberation Forces have already begun rolling in. And in the middle of that chaos, one man is quietly doing something no one could possibly understand. He is putting the Saigon government's chief of secret police, one of the fiercest anti-communists in the country, into a car so he can escape safely. He is helping the enemy of his own side flee. That man's name is Pham Xuan An. To the world, he was a journalist, not just any journalist. He was the only Vietnamese reporter ever hired as a staff correspondent by America's Time magazine. He drank coffee with American generals. He was close friends with legendary war correspondents who had won Pulitzer Prizes. He seemed to know the news before it happened, and his Western colleagues called him the man who understood the Vietnam War better than anyone. But none of them knew the truth. The truth is that for nearly 15 years, that charming, quick-witted reporter had been sending almost 500 top-secret documents to the other side. He held the rank of general in the People's Army of Vietnam. He had a code name, X6, and what he sent changed the course of an entire war. General Vo Nguyen Giap, reading his reports, is said to have uttered a line that became legend. He said it now felt like they were sitting right inside America's own war room. Stop for a second and think about that. Throughout the Vietnam War, the Americans had bombers. They had spy satellites. They had one of the largest intelligence machines humanity had ever built. And yet one man, working alone, with no gun, no radio cipher, just a typewriter and a dog, managed to sit inside the heart of that machine and read its secrets. And here's the part that's hardest to believe. He didn't hate America. Quite the opposite. He loved America. He had lived in California, studied journalism there, made American friends he cherished like family until the day he died. He once said that he had two loves in his life, one for his homeland and one for the American friends who had taught him everything. He called it his own private tragedy. So how does a man love a country with his whole heart and still spend his life fighting against it? How did he keep the secret for so long, surrounded by some of the sharpest intelligence minds in the world? And why, at the very moment of final victory, did he turn around and save his own enemy? This isn't a spy story out of a movie. This really happened. It's about a man split in two, living in two worlds at once, carrying inside his chest two loyalties that should never have been able to coexist. This is the story of the perfect spy. And to understand how he became this man, we have to go back a long way, to one morning in a colonial land almost 100 years ago when he was just a boy who had never known war. Chapter 1. The Ordinary World. To understand Pham Xuan An, you first have to understand the land that made him. Picture Vietnam in 1927. Back then, the country wasn't even called Vietnam on the maps of the men who ruled it. It was part of French Indochina, a colony. The French had arrived nearly 70 years earlier, bringing guns, and had stayed to take away the rubber, the rice, the coal. They built tree-lined boulevards in Saigon, red-tiled villas, Parisian-style cafes. But behind that beauty lay a bitter truth. Vietnamese people were strangers in their own homeland. Into that world, on September 12, 1927, a boy was born in Bien Hoa, a small town on the banks of the Dong Nai River, not far from Saigon. His parents named him Un. In Vietnamese, that name carries an almost prophetic meaning. Un means hidden, concealed, unseen. No one in that family could have imagined that the name they chose would come to define an entire life. Un's father was an educated man, a land surveyor for the colonial government. It wasn't a wealthy family, but it was decent, and it valued learning. In a colonial society where most people couldn't read or write, going to school was already a privilege. And from a very young age, Un was an unusual child. He was curious, almost to a fault. He wanted to know how everything worked, why this creature ate that one, why this bird sang differently from that one. He was captivated by the natural world. He raised birds, watched fish, noticed the smallest habits of animals. People often say children like that grow up to become scientists or writers. Few could have guessed that this same meticulous, observant mind, this ability to look at one small detail and infer the whole picture, would one day become the most dangerous weapon of one of the greatest spies of the 20th century. But back then, he was just a boy. And his childhood, like that of millions of Vietnamese of his generation, grew up inside a strange feeling. It was the feeling of a people being made to feel small on their own land. Vietnamese children learned French history in school. They were taught that their ancestors were the Gauls, a people all the way in Europe. They were taught to revere Mother France, the French language, French culture. Meanwhile, their own language, their own history, their own heroes were pushed to the margins. For many, that humiliation festered like a wound that never healed, and for a small few, it became a question that would follow them their whole lives. Why do we have to live like outsiders in our own homeland, and when will it end? The boy Un grew up with that question, even if as a child he might not yet have had the words for it. Here's the interesting thing. If you looked at young Pham Xuan An, you would never have seen a warrior. He wasn't loud, wasn't aggressive, he was quiet, quick to smile, easy to get along with, someone who liked telling stories and hearing them. He had a dry, gentle sense of humor that put people at ease around him. Later on, those very qualities, the ones that looked so mild, would be exactly what kept him alive. Because no one is on guard against a man who is always smiling. No one imagines the most dangerous person in the room is the one making the whole table laugh. But there was still a long road ahead before any of that. The Vietnam of Un's childhood was a pressure cooker slowly heating up. Beneath the calm surface of the colonial streets, a fire was burning. Everywhere, groups of people had begun gathering in secret, whispering about a dangerous idea, that Vietnamese people could rule their own country. There were peaceful movements calling for reform. There were radical movements calling for revolution. And among them, an organization was growing in the shadows, one that would one day be known as Viet Minh, the League for Vietnamese Independence. Young Un knew nothing about any of this yet, but the world around him was changing by the day, and the pace of that change was about to accelerate in the most brutal way. Because on the other side of the globe, a Second World War was breaking out, and when that fire reached Asia, it would strike a fatal blow to the very colonial order the boy had grown up inside. In 1940, France fell to Nazi Germany in Europe. Within months, an empire that had once seemed unbeatable was brought to its knees. And that news struck Indochina like a thunderclap. Colonial subjects saw something they had never before dared to believe. Their rulers were not gods. They could lose. They could be beaten. Then Japanese troops moved into Indochina. Over the following years, Vietnamese people witnessed something almost unimaginable. The French, the once arrogant white masters, now had to bow before another Asian army. An entire myth of Western superiority shattered before their eyes. And once you've seen that the emperor has no clothes, you can never unsee it. For teenage Un, these were formative years. His country was being torn between two foreign powers. People were starving, and in that suffocating atmosphere, the longing for independence stopped being a whisper. It began to roar. The terrible famine of 1945 hit, killing millions of Vietnamese people in the north. Bodies lay scattered in the streets. It was one of the darkest tragedies in the nation's history, and it burned a cold, hard truth into an entire generation's mind. Under someone else's rule, a Vietnamese life was worth almost nothing. For young men like Un, the question was no longer whether to fight. The question had become how, and this was the turning point of his life. Because the boy who loved birds, the quiet teenager who liked to laugh, was about to face a choice that would take him out of his ordinary world forever. He didn't know it yet, but a call was coming, and it would arrive in the most painful way a person could imagine, through the death of a friend. Chapter 2. The Call to Adventure. That friend's name was Tet. He was a young man like so many other patriots of his generation. He believed in one simple but dangerous idea, that Vietnamese people deserve to rule their own country. He joined the resistance, helping organize the student movement in the South. He was young, he was passionate, and he believed the future lay ahead of him. Then he was arrested. His captors wanted him to give up his comrades. They tortured him. Thak didn't talk. He held out until his last breath, and he died at 21 years old. Sit with that age for a moment. 21. The age when a person should be falling in love, dreaming, just starting to build a life, and yet he chose death over betrayal. For those left behind, a death like that isn't only a loss, it's a question hurled straight at the conscience. My friend dared to die for what he believed. What am I willing to do? For Pham Xuan An, this was the moment everything changed. The quiet teenager who once loved watching birds was now a grown man, and Thac's death lit a fire in him that would never go out. This was no longer a matter of books or abstract ideals. This was blood. This was someone he knew, someone he cared about, cut down. And from then on, his path became clear in the coldest, starkest way. But you need to understand something about Pham Xuan An. He wasn't the kind of man who would pick up a rifle and charge into battle until he fell. That wasn't what he was made for. His weapon wasn't a gun. His weapon was his mind. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, Pham Xuan An began his path into the revolution. At one point, he held a job considered among the most prestigious of the time, a tax official for the colonial government, a position, according to some accounts, held by only a few dozen people in all of Indochina. It was a stable future, a safe path, a comfortable life, and he gave it up. Stop and think about that decision. He had everything he needed to live an easy life under the old order. He had education, a good job, a future, and he walked away from all of it to follow a path whose destination, almost certainly, was prison or death. That's not the decision of a reckless man. That's the decision of a man who had seen something larger than himself. And then history turned another corner. In 1945, when the Second World War ended, the Vietnamese declared independence, but the French refused to let go. They came back to reclaim their old colony. And so began what would later be called the First Indochina War, a 9-year conflict between the French army and the Viet Minh forces. This is important context for a Western audience, because many people, when they think of Vietnam, only think of the war with America in the 1960s and 70s. But for the Vietnamese, that was only round 2. Round 1 was the war against France, and that first war ended in a way that shook the entire world. In 1954, in a remote valley in the northwest called Dien Bien Phu, Viet Minh forces did something no one thought possible. They besieged and completely defeated a powerful French military stronghold. For the first time in modern history, a colonized Asian people had defeated the army of a Western power in a major battle. Dien Bien Phu rang out across the globe like a bell, announcing the end of the colonial era. But that victory didn't bring full independence. At an international conference in Geneva, Vietnam was split in two, with the 17th parallel as a temporary border. The North belonged to the revolutionary government. The South belonged to a government backed by the West. There was supposed to be a nationwide election to reunify the country. That election never happened. And into that vacuum, a new power stepped in to take France's place. America. This is the world our entire story unfolds in. A divided country, a war that hadn't really ended, and a new superpower moving in. And it was during that first war against France that something new was born. Something that would shape the rest of Pham Xuan An's life. That thing was revolutionary intelligence. In 1951, in the middle of the fierce resistance war against France, the Strategic Intelligence Organization of the Vietnamese Revolution was officially born. The idea behind it was both simple and audacious. A force that was weaker in weapons, smaller in numbers, and poorer in money. What could it use to defeat a far stronger enemy? The answer was information. If you know in advance what your enemy is going to do, you don't need to be as strong as them. You just need to be in the right place at the right time. And they realized that the young Pham Xuan An had a rare gift for this kind of work. He was intelligent. He was sharply observant. He had a talent for analysis, the ability to look at one small piece of information and infer an entire strategic picture. He had a natural charm that made people want to talk to him and trust him. And above all, he had an almost extraordinary calm, the ability to stay composed even when a storm was raging inside him. One of the people who guided him in his early years was Dr. Pham Ngoc Thach, a great intellectual and revolutionary who later became the Minister of Health. These were people of a very particular generation, men who carried both a Western education and a burning love of country. And they saw in this young man a potential he himself might not yet have recognized. But the path of intelligence work is unlike any other. A soldier who falls on the battlefield is at least known to his comrades, honored, remembered as a hero. An intelligence officer is different. If he succeeds, no one ever knows. If he fails, he dies in silence, and sometimes even gets remembered by his own people as a traitor. He has to live a life where his greatest achievements must be hidden from everyone, even those he loves most. Pham Xuan An understood that cost clearly, and he chose it anyway. But here, the story takes a turn no one could have predicted, because his superiors didn't give him the ordinary assignment of a spy. They didn't tell him to shadow a target or to infiltrate an agency. They were looking much further ahead than that. They saw something that almost no one at the time would have dared to imagine. They realized that the war with France would eventually end, but behind France, a far greater power was drawing near, a superpower from across the ocean, richer, stronger, and more dangerous than any enemy Vietnam had ever faced: America. And if Vietnam were ever to face America, it would need one thing. It would need a man who understood Americans from the inside out, who understood how they thought, how they spoke, how they made decisions. A man who could sit among them without anyone realizing he wasn't one of them. But how do you train someone like that? How do you teach a young Vietnamese man to understand America so thoroughly that he could fool Americans themselves? Their answer was bold to the point of seeming reckless. They would send him to America, not to spy, to study, to live, to become, in some sense, an American. And the man behind that extraordinary plan, the mentor who would shape the entire course of Pham Xuan An's life as a spy, is about to enter our story. Chapter 3: Refusal and the Mentor. Every great story has a mentor. Someone who sees in the hero something the hero hasn't yet seen in himself and pushes him across a threshold he would never dare cross alone. For Pham Xuan An, that mentor was a man known by the codename Muoi Huong. Muoi Huong was one of the finest organizational minds in Vietnamese revolutionary intelligence. He wasn't the type to command through authority. He was a builder of people. He looked at an individual and saw not who they were now, but who they might become years down the line. And when he looked at Pham Xuan An, he saw a piece around which an entire game could turn. The idea from Muoi Huong and from the intelligence leadership of the time was to plant a seed for the future. They would send An to America to study journalism. Journalism, because no other profession on earth lets a person ask questions about everything, meet anyone, show up anywhere, without arousing suspicion. Journalists are allowed to be curious. It's their job. A spy disguised as a journalist is like a fish disguised as water. No one notices it because it's exactly where it's supposed to be. But this plan demanded an almost unimaginable patience. It wouldn't bear fruit in a month, a year, even several years. It was a decades-long investment. They were planting a seed today, knowing the harvest might not come for 10, 15 years. And in the meantime, that seed would have to survive entirely on its own, alone, inside the heart of the enemy, with no one to shield it, no one to protect it. It was a gamble with almost unthinkable risks. If Un was exposed, he would die. If he stayed in America too long and America won him over, the entire plan would collapse. If a single link in the chain broke, everything would fall apart, and yet they decided to take the bet anyway. That tells you how much they believed in this man. And here we have to talk about a truth few people know. The road to this mission was anything but smooth, and Pham Xuan An himself didn't walk into it lightly, because right at the moment he was preparing to leave, tragedy struck his family. His father fell gravely ill, the father he loved and respected, the man who had raised him, who represented the entire ordinary world he was about to leave behind. And on September 24, 1957, his father died. Imagine the weight on a son's shoulders at that moment. He had just lost his father. He was in mourning. By any normal custom, this was the time for a son to stay, to look after his family, to let the grief settle. And yet, just 16 days after burying his father, on October 10, 1957, Pham Xuan An boarded a journey to the other side of the world. 16 days. That was the entire pause fate allowed him between burying his father and beginning a life that, from then on, he would have to live in endless deception. People often picture spies as cold, unfeeling, machine-like, but the truth about Pham Xuan An was the exact opposite. He was a man of deep feeling, so deep it sometimes caused him real pain. He loved his family, he loved his friends, he loved his homeland in the most profound way, and precisely because he felt everything so deeply, the cost of what he was about to do weighed all the heavier. Leaving, for him, wasn't an exciting adventure. It was a sacrifice. He left behind everything familiar, everything safe, to step into an uncertain future in a foreign land, carrying a secret that could get him killed at any moment. But he went anyway, because he believed, because a friend named Tet had died for that belief, because his father and an entire people deserved to live in a free country, and because a mentor named Muoi Huong had looked him in the eye and said, "This is something only you can do." And so the young Pham Xuan An stepped onto the ship that would carry him away from Vietnam. He didn't know that, on the other side, America was waiting, not to kill him, but to do something far stranger. America was about to seduce him. It was about to teach him everything. It was about to give him friends he would love for the rest of his life. And in doing so, it was about to create the very man who would become one of the most dangerous spies ever to work against it. The greatest paradox of Pham Xuan An's life was about to begin, and it would begin in a place you would never expect, a small, peaceful seaside town in California. Chapter 4: America Creates a Spy. The town was called Costa Mesa in Orange County, California, and the school he attended was Orange Coast College. Picture the scene, the late 1950s. America is at the height of its post-war prosperity. Shiny cars glide down the freeways. Rock and roll plays on the radio. This is the America of the American dream, confident, wealthy, brimming with energy. And into that world walks a thin young man from Vietnam, carrying a secret no one around him could possibly imagine. To his classmates, he was simply a likable foreign student. He was the school's first Vietnamese student, a rarity that made everyone curious. He was smart, eager to learn, and carried himself with a composure well beyond his years. Before long, his classmates gave him an affectionate nickname. They called him Confucius. The name evoked an Eastern sage, a man who seemed to know more than he let on. They had no idea how accurate that nickname really was. Unstudied journalism. He wrote for the school newspaper, The Barnacle. He learned how a story is built, how to ask a question, how to draw information out of what looks like a harmless conversation. He learned how Americans write, how they think, how they argue, and more important than anything he learned in class, he learned how to become one of them. And he learned with a thoroughness that's genuinely striking. He didn't just learn in a classroom, he lived America. He moved through it, watched it, absorbed its rhythm, the way people greeted each other, the way they joked, the way they disagreed and still respected one another. He learned something no textbook could teach. He learned from the inside how a free society actually works, the psychology that shapes Americans, the values they hold sacred, and the fears they keep hidden. And this, more than anything, was the real weapon. Because later, sitting among American officers and officials in Saigon, Un never had to play the part of someone who understood Americans. He genuinely did. He could guess how they'd react to a given situation, how they'd decide under pressure, through what lens they saw the war. He could read Americans because part of him had actually become American. That was the most dangerous gift America ever unknowingly gave him. He even interned at a real American newspaper, the Sacramento Bee, to get a taste of the American newsroom from the inside. He saw firsthand how a newsroom operated, how a story was chased down and verified. Every skill he picked up here would later become another layer of armor for his cover. But at the time, to him, it was simply learning a craft, and he learned it with genuine passion. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because something happened in California that was never part of anyone's plan. Pham Xuan An began to love America. Not a fake love, put on to serve his cover, a real one. He loved the openness of Americans, the way they spoke their minds, laughed loudly, treated a poor foreign student as an equal. He made real friends, good people who had opened their arms to a lonely young man from the other side of the world. There was an American man he grew close to, close enough that he later thought of him as a second father. He was the manager of the dormitory where Un lived. That man taught him to drive, taught him American sports, and, more importantly, helped him through the loneliness and the still raw grief of losing his own father. Years later, Un still spoke of him with undimmed gratitude. He said that when he first arrived, he'd felt deeply alone, and it was this man who made him feel welcome. Stop and sit with that for a moment. Here is a man sent to America with an ultimate mission to work against it. and yet it was there that he found kindness, friendship, something close to family. How does a person live with that contradiction? How can you love a place while knowing your whole life will be spent fighting against what it does to your homeland? This is the very core of the entire tragedy of Pham Xuan An. He wasn't a fanatic who hated his enemy. He was a man who loved both sides and was torn right down the middle. He would later say something that has haunted people ever since. He said he had two loves in his life, one for his homeland and one for the American friends who had taught him everything, from the very first thing to the very last. And he called that his own private trouble. There's one small detail that says a great deal. In his public speaking class, Un was originally given a C. The reason was that he kept unconsciously using words like oppression, exploitation, imperialism, words he had absorbed from too much revolutionary reading. His teacher had no idea what any of it meant, but it shows something. However much America charmed him, deep down, the fire was still burning. He hadn't forgotten who he was or why he had come. There was even a moment when an English teacher, herself a former intelligence officer in World War II, asked him why he studied so hard. A question that sounded casual but was dangerous for a future spy. Un didn't flinch. He simply said his homeland was poor, and that was why he wanted to study hard, so he could return and serve it. That was true. It just wasn't the whole truth. America liked him enough to want to keep him. He was offered opportunities that millions of people around the world could only dream of. A good job with good pay, even a scholarship to pursue a doctorate. For a young man from a poor colonial country, that was an entire horizon opening up. He could have stayed. He could have had an easy, respected, comfortable life on American soil. And then a letter arrived from home. The letter was carefully disguised, its real meaning hidden inside a story that seemed harmless. Something about a dog and a parrot, as if it were just family news around Tet. But Un read the real message hidden underneath. His mentor, Muoi Huong, had been arrested. The network was in danger. The organization needed him. And here, Pham Xuan An faced the biggest choice of his life. On one side, America, safety, prosperity, a bright future, friends he loved, a life free of lies, free of danger. All he had to do was stay and take it. On the other side, Vietnam, danger, endless deception, death always lurking. A mission that, if successful, no one would ever know about. And if it failed, he would die in the dark. A promise to a friend now gone, to a people, to himself. He chose to go back. He turned down the scholarship. He turned down the job. He turned down an entire life. He packed his bags, turned his back on the America he loved, and set out for a country waiting for him to do something that might well get him killed. The young man who boarded the ship out of California was not the same young man who had arrived 2 years earlier. He had changed. He had learned to think like an American, speak like an American, understand Americans down to the bone. America had given him the very weapon he would use against it. Muoi Huong's reckless plan had worked. They had sent away a young man and gotten back a person who could move between two worlds without anyone ever noticing. Now the real work was about to begin. Because back in Vietnam, Pham Xuan An had to do the hardest thing in the intelligence trade. He had to build a fake life so perfect it could fool even the sharpest minds around him. And he had to do it right in the heart of Saigon, under the eyes of the secret police, of American intelligence, of everyone whose one small slip could tear off his mask in an instant. He was about to walk into the tiger's den, and he wouldn't walk in alone. Chapter 5: Tests, Allies, and Enemies. Pham Xuan An returned to Saigon at the end of 1959, and the very first thing he did shows you, right away, the cold professionalism of this man. He didn't rush into action. He waited. He kept himself hidden for almost an entire month, watching for anyone following him, any sign that he had already been exposed. He was a fish that had just returned to dangerous waters, and before swimming out into the open, it lay still at the bottom, testing every ripple. Only once he was certain it was safe did he begin, and the first step was building his cover. For a spy, a cover is a matter of life and death. It has to be perfect. It can't just be a lie. It has to be an entire life he actually lives every day, full down to the smallest detail, so complete that even he almost believes it himself. For Pham Xuan An, that cover was journalism. He started at Vietnamese, the Saigon government's official news agency. Then an opportunity opened up. He was hired by Reuters, the prestigious British wire service. This was a brilliant move. As a correspondent for a Western news agency, he had a legitimate reason to approach anyone, ask anything, be anywhere. Every door opens for a journalist. But Pham Xuan An didn't stop there. He had a foresight few spies ever possess. He realized that if he stayed an ordinary war correspondent covering battles, he would only ever scratch the surface. What he needed was a deeper layer, the level where people discuss strategy, military doctrine, the big decisions shaping the whole war. So he elevated himself, turning himself into a writer specializing in defense and strategic affairs, someone generals and senior officers came to see as an equal worth talking to. And the pinnacle of his cover arrived in 1965, when he was hired by Time magazine, one of the most powerful publications in America. This was no small thing. Over time, he became the only Vietnamese staff correspondent Time ever had. Think about that position. A man carrying the credentials of America's leading news magazine, trusted by American officials, invited to closed press briefings, given access to sources almost no one else had. From that vantage point, he could see the war from inside the very machine waging it. The center of his world was a cafe called Givral on one of Saigon's most fashionable streets. This was where journalists, officers, officials, and diplomats gathered every day to trade news and rumor. People jokingly called it Radio Catanat, Saigon's own broadcast station, and Pham Xuan An was, in a sense, the master of that station. He sat there, sipped his coffee, told jokes, and listened, always listening. At one point, the government even bought out the cafe to bug it. An knew. He simply stayed calm, sometimes deliberately swearing loudly to ruin whatever was being recorded. That was who he was, turning his enemy's own trap into his own private joke. And here, we need to talk about one of the strangest relationships in his entire life. Because to build his cover, An had to befriend exactly the men most dangerous to him. One of them was Chun Kim Thuyen, the head of the Diem government's secret police apparatus. The very man whose job it was to hunt down communist spies was the one who helped An land his first jobs, opening important doors for him. And an even more formidable figure was Edward Lansdale, an American intelligence officer many consider the architect behind the early Saigon regime. Lansdale was a master of psychological warfare, an intelligence legend, the man widely believed to be the inspiration for the main character in the famous novel The Quiet American. And Pham Xuan An worked closely with that very man. He served as an interpreter for him at times, learning from Lansdale about the art of psychological warfare, about how Americans thought and acted. Picture the sheer irony of the situation. A revolutionary spy, in effect, learning his trade from one of the enemy's own top intelligence minds. The enemy teaching him how to defeat the enemy without ever knowing it. This is what set Pham Xuan An apart. He didn't just hide in the crowd. He walked straight into the center of power, made friends with the men at the very top, and turned their own trust into his most valuable source. The closer he stood to the fire, the more its light blinded everyone to any suspicion. But his true genius wasn't in stealing secrets, it was in how he analyzed them. An drew a sharp line between two things people often confuse. One is raw information, scraps of news anyone can pick up. The other is real intelligence, the meaning hidden beneath those scraps, the larger picture they form together. Anyone can gather information, very few can turn it into intelligence. There's an anecdote that captures this mind perfectly. It said, An could read the state of the war just by watching Saigon's bird and pet market. If a certain insect used as bird feed suddenly grew scarce, he would infer that the rural area producing it had likely fallen under revolutionary control, cutting off the supply into the city. From a single grasshopper at the market, he could read an entire situation. That's the kind of thinking no spy school could ever teach. It was the instinct of a man who, since childhood, had studied the natural world with a scientist's precision. But even the best spy, no matter how brilliant, can't survive alone. And this is the part Hollywood spy movies almost always get wrong. They paint spies as lone heroes. The truth is the opposite. Behind Pham Xuan An stood an entire silent network, and they were the real heroes whose names have never been told. That network had a name, H-63. The H-63 intelligence cluster was established in 1962. It wasn't just Pham Xuan An. It was a machine made up of dozens of people, each one a link in the chain, protecting him and carrying the secrets he gathered out to the revolutionary base. The cluster's commander went by the codename Tu Tang, at once his superior, his friend, and the living shield who protected An's identity through the war's most brutal years. But within that network, there were two women whose stories will leave you speechless. The first was Mrs. Nguyen Ba. She was Pham Xuan An's main courier for nearly 15 years, from 1961 until final victory in 1975. Her job was to carry top-secret documents from An's hands out to the revolutionary base. And here's the detail that's almost impossible to believe. Mrs. Ba couldn't read. She didn't even know where An lived. The two of them never used a phone, never used radio, never wrote letters. For 15 years, they were one of the strangest and most effective intelligence pairings in history. Picture her work. Every day she carried on her person papers that, if searched and discovered, would mean arrest, torture, and almost certain death. She hid documents inside packets of fermented pork, at the bottom of market baskets, mixed in among the most ordinary things. She walked past checkpoints, past secret police, past informants everywhere, with the calm face of a woman simply out doing her shopping. Nearly 15 years, hundreds of trips, and not once did a document fall into enemy hands. Not once. The second woman went by the codename Tam Tao. She came from a wealthy silk trading family in Saigon, beautiful, graceful, and it was precisely that image of a well-bred young lady that let her move freely inside enemy territory without arousing suspicion. She was a crucial link in the chain, and at times, she was the one connecting An directly to the organization. On one occasion, she carried an entire shipment of film rolls containing top-secret documents. Discovery would have meant instant execution, and the way they passed information along was ingenious to a degree that's genuinely startling. Sometimes, An wrote his reports in an invisible ink made from rice water, starch, using a goose feather quill on ordinary paper. Look at the page, and it appeared perfectly blank. Only when the recipient at the base applied a special solution would the writing appear. He hid documents in dead drops, places where the two of them never had to meet face to face. He would walk his German shepherd, and somewhere in that leisurely stroll, a document would be left exactly where it needed to be. That dog, incidentally, was also part of his craft. It was both the pet of a Saigon gentleman and a guard that would alert him whenever a stranger approached, letting him photograph documents at night with peace of mind. Everything in Pham Xuan An's life had two layers of meaning: what people saw and what was really happening underneath. And in the middle of that network, surrounded by people willing to die to protect him, Pham Xuan An began doing the work that would carve his name into legend. He began sending out the secrets that would shake the entire war. But the line between life and death had never been thinner, and his first great triumph was about to unfold on a small rice paddy few people had ever heard of, a place called Ap Bac. Chapter 6: Into the Den. To understand why Ap Bac mattered so much, you need to understand what the Americans were counting on at the time. In the early 1960s, the US hadn't yet sent in large numbers of combat troops. Instead, they pursued a strategy they called special war. The idea was for the Saigon army to do the fighting directly, while the Americans provided weapons, money, and, most importantly, sophisticated new tactics behind the scenes. They believed modern technology would crush barefoot guerrillas. The strategy's two miracle weapons had impressive-sounding names. One was airmobile assault, using helicopters to drop troops suddenly right in the middle of enemy positions. The other was armored assault, using amphibious tanks to roll straight across rice paddies, something the liberation forces had almost nothing to counter. The Americans were certain guerrilla fighters would panic and scatter in the face of both. On paper, it was a flawless strategy. There was just one problem. The other side already knew. In early January 1963, at Ap Bac, a small village in Mita Province in the Mekong Delta, a small liberation force, only about 350 fighters, found itself surrounded by a Saigon army more than 4 times its size, equipped with helicopters, armored vehicles, artillery, and American advisors. By every measure, this should have been a massacre. The weaker side should have been wiped out. The opposite happened. The liberation troops didn't panic. They held their positions, waiting, with plans already worked out in detail for exactly these tactics. When American helicopters came down, they flew straight into a wall of prepared fire. Several were hit, a number crashed right into the paddies. When the amphibious tanks pushed in, they met resistance they should never have encountered. And when the smoke cleared, the powerful, American-backed Saigon force had to retreat in disarray, leaving their dead comrades on the field. For the Americans, it was a shock. An American advisor present that day, along with a young journalist named Neil Sheehan, who would later win a Pulitzer Prize, watched firsthand as the army they'd placed all their faith in fell apart. Ap Bac became America's first warning sign that this war would not be nearly as easy as they'd thought. The shock was so great that American officials sat down to work out exactly what had gone wrong. A U.S. intelligence assessment shortly after the battle reached a striking conclusion: that the enemy had proven itself a formidable adversary with an effective guerrilla force, and that one of the key factors behind that strength was the enemy's effective intelligence system. Let that sentence sit for a moment. The Americans, dissecting their own defeat, pointed straight at enemy intelligence as a cause. They had come remarkably close to the truth without ever knowing it, because part of that effective intelligence system was sitting right among them, drinking coffee with them every morning, carrying the business card of a Western news outlet. The American advisor present at Ap Bac that day, an officer named John Paul Vann, couldn't hide his bitter frustration at how the Saigon army had fallen apart. And that frustration, captured and reported by American journalists, began planting the first seeds of doubt in the American public about the war. Ap Bac wasn't just a battle. It was the moment the curtain first began to lift. But there's a question almost no outsider asked at the time. How did the liberation forces know so precisely how to counter such advanced tactics? How did they prepare exactly the right response for exactly the right weapons, when these were brand new tactics no one had seen before? Part of the answer lies in the documents Pham Xuan An had been sending out. An, in his cover as a military affairs correspondent, had access to analyses of these new tactics. He studied them, broke them down, and passed that understanding on to the revolution. So when the battle came, the other side wasn't caught off guard. They already knew what the monster looked like before it showed up. According to one intelligence commander, it was An who informed them of the new tactics the Americans were rolling out, giving them the chance to work out how to counter them. For this achievement, Pham Xuan An received his first Combat Achievement Medal as a spy, but he accepted it in the way only he could. When told of the award, he simply said quietly that he had no idea whether he'd live long enough to actually wear it. That was the naked truth of his profession. Glory existed, but it always came wrapped in the shadow of death. And Ap Bac was only the beginning, because around the same time, An carried out an operation whose scale would make Ap Bac look like a warm-up act. The Americans and the Saigon government were rolling out a massive program called the Strategic Hamlet Program. Its logic was cold but clever. To defeat the guerrillas, you had to separate them from the people, like draining a pond to catch the fish. So they planned to herd millions of farmers into fortified, guarded hamlets, cutting the link between the population and the revolutionary forces hidden among them. If the plan succeeded, it could strangle the entire resistance, and the whole plan, from its strategic intent down to every step of implementation, fell into revolutionary hands. According to available records, Pham Xuan An sent out a massive volume of material, recorded across multiple rolls of film, laying bare the enemy's entire intent. One intelligence leader, upon receiving it, is said to have exclaimed that not even $1 billion could buy documents like these. Think about the weight of that statement. In Pham Xuan An's hands were pages worth more than any fortune. Their value had nothing to do with gold or silver. It lay in the fact that they contained the most precious thing in any war. They contained the future. They let the other side see the enemy's next move before it was ever made. And here is what made Pham Xuan An's greatness so singular, what set him apart from every ordinary spy. He never had to steal a single document. He didn't sneak into a records room at midnight, didn't crack a safe, didn't secretly photograph stolen files. He didn't need to. The very people working for the Americans handed him the documents themselves, asking him, a learned journalist they trusted, to help analyze them. They voluntarily placed their secrets in his hands because they believed he was one of them. The author of the most famous book about him, an American scholar named Larry Berman, put it perfectly. He said, Pham Xuan An never had to steal a single document because he was both a genuine, professional journalist and a genuine, professional spy. His cover wasn't a mask. It was a real career, built so seriously that no one had any reason to doubt it. But every document he sent pulled him further into danger. Every success raised the price of failure even higher. He was walking a tightrope stretched over an abyss, and that rope grew thinner by the day. Because the war was about to enter its bloodiest phase. America was about to pour 500,000 troops into Vietnam, and in the middle of that firestorm, Pham Xuan An would face the most terrifying test of his life, the moment where a single misstep would end everything. Chapter 7. The Ultimate Test. Pham Xuan An had a saying about his own profession, and it captures perfectly the pressure he lived under every single day. He said a spy has to be like a goldfish, lying deep at the bottom of the sea. The moment it surfaces, it's caught for certain. For nearly 15 years, Pham Xuan An lived exactly like that fish. Every day, every hour, never surfacing, never letting so much as a ripple show. Try to imagine just how heavy that pressure really was. He woke up every morning and played a part. He had lunch with people who, if they knew who he really was, would have had him executed on the spot. He laughed with American officers, drank with Saigon's secret police, argued strategy with men trying to destroy the very forces he served. And through every single one of those moments, he had to control every glance, every word, every flicker of expression on his face. One wrong twitch of an eyebrow could have been the end. He couldn't even confide in the people closest to him. His wife knew he was doing something dangerous, but even she had to live in a kind of deliberate fog for her own safety. She once said she always felt like a fish on the chopping block, and she carried a suicide pill with her at all times, in case the worst ever happened. That was the price his whole family paid, living under one roof and still having to hide from each other the most important parts of their lives. And then, in 1968, the greatest storm of all arrived. That year, during Tet, the most sacred moment of the Vietnamese calendar, revolutionary forces launched a simultaneous coordinated offensive against cities across the south, including Saigon. The world would come to know this as the Tet Offensive. Commandos even struck inside the grounds of the American embassy, right in the heart of Saigon. All of America watched, stunned, on television. In purely military terms, the offensive came at an enormous cost. Revolutionary forces suffered heavy losses. Looking only at the map of the fighting, many considered it a defeat. But this is where Pham Xuan An's genius for analysis shone in a way no one else could match. While many people saw only the losses, An saw something deeper. He understood Americans. He understood their psychology, understood the power of media and public opinion in American society. And he recognized that, even in military defeat, the offensive was a devastating psychological and political blow struck straight at America, because for years, the American government had been telling its own people that victory was near, that the enemy was on the verge of collapse. Then suddenly, right in the middle of Tet, that same enemy attacked everywhere at once, including the American embassy itself. The American public looked at their television screens and asked themselves, if we're winning, how could this be happening? Trust collapsed, the anti-war movement surged, and the road toward the negotiating table, toward America's gradual withdrawal from the war, began. And look at what actually happened in the months that followed. The sitting American president, the man who had escalated the war, announced he would not run for another term. The general commanding all U.S. forces in Vietnam was replaced, and peace talks began in Paris. All of that political upheaval on the other side of the world traced back to the psychological shock the Tet Offensive dealt to America's confidence, exactly as Pham Xuan An had read it. While the rest of the world was still counting bodies and tallying battlefield gains and losses, he had already seen where the real battlefield was. It was in the living room of every American household, on their television screens, in the hearts of American voters. An saw all of this, and he analyzed it with cold precision. This is exactly why his reports were priceless. He wasn't just passing along numbers and events, he was passing along understanding. He was decoding the enemy's mind. And this brings us to the line that has become legendary. General Vo Nguyen Giap, Vietnam's legendary commander, upon reading intelligence reports of the quality Un provided, is said to have remarked that it now felt as though they were sitting right inside America's own war room. One version of the story has it that reading Pham Xuan An's reports felt like standing inside the enemy's Joint Chiefs of Staff itself. Stop and feel the weight of that. This is the highest praise a spy could ever receive. It means his work was so good, it erased the line between the two sides. It means that, because of him, revolutionary leaders could see the war through the enemy's own eyes. But every success pushed him closer to the edge. During those chaotic years, there were moments that came agonizingly close to disaster. Moments where the whole thing nearly collapsed. Couriers were caught. Links in the chain were compromised. Over its nearly 15 years of operation, the H-63 cluster lost dozens of its members. According to Vietnamese sources, somewhere between 27 and 28 people, every single one of them, once captured, held pieces of the puzzle that could have led straight to Un. And yet not one of them ever gave him up. Not one. Think about that loyalty. Ordinary people, most of them unknown, chose to endure torture, imprisonment, death, rather than betray a comrade many of them had never even met face to face. Pham Xuan An's survival wasn't only a matter of his own talent. It was built on the silent sacrifice of an entire group of people willing to carry his secret to their graves. And to understand just how fragile that survival really was, look at the sheer care that went into simply passing along a single document. Un and Mrs. Ba never communicated through any ordinary means. No phone, no radio, not a single line of writing. Every meeting was a performance, choreographed down to the second. Before the two of them approached each other, a safety signal had to already be in place. A small sign left at an agreed spot, a chalk mark, an object placed just so. If that signal was there, it meant it was safe, and the meeting could go ahead. If it wasn't there, then no matter how long they had waited, no matter how important the document, the meeting was canceled immediately. The two of them would quietly drift apart, like two strangers who had never met. There's a paradox in this craft that only people in the trade truly understand. You'd think meeting somewhere quiet and secluded would be safer. It's actually the opposite. In a deserted spot, two people finding each other is far too easy to notice, and if one of them is being watched, the other is instantly exposed too. So instead, they chose the busiest places, noisy markets, crowded streets full of people coming and going, where two faces could blend into hundreds of others. And there were moments that came terrifyingly close to disaster. It's said that once, while waiting to receive a document, Mrs. Ba noticed a man pacing suspiciously back and forth near the meeting point. The instinct of a seasoned courier told her something was wrong. She didn't take the document. She managed to warn Un that the location had been compromised, and both of them pulled back. That one moment of caution, one well-timed glance, may have saved an entire network. Because in this line of work, the line between safety and disaster can sometimes be as thin as a single second of hesitation. Imagine living like that for almost 15 years. Every meeting a gamble with death. Every day that passed safely was the result of iron discipline, a vigilance that could never, not even once, be allowed to slip. There was almost no room for luck in this profession. This is the part glamorous spy movies rarely tell you. Behind every great spy stands countless ordinary people who paid with their own lives. Un understood this well. Perhaps that too was part of the weight he carried. He lived in part because others had died so that he could, and he repaid that debt the only way he knew how, by making his work as excellent as it could possibly be. By turning every document, every analysis, into something that actually mattered to the course of the war. That excellence carried him to the very top of his profession. But glory, for Pham Xuan An, was never a simple joy, because the higher he rose, the lonelier he became. And the true cost of this double life was something he was about to have to look at directly. Chapter 8. Seizing the Sword. In 1969, Pham Xuan An reached a milestone no Vietnamese person before him had ever reached. He became a full-staff correspondent for Time magazine, the only Vietnamese person ever to hold that position. On the surface, this was the pinnacle of an enviable journalism career. His American colleagues respected him. His editors trusted him. He carried the credentials of one of the most powerful magazines on the planet. In Saigon, he was one of the most sought-after journalists, someone everyone wanted to sit with, everyone wanted to hear, analyze the war, and his analysis was often accurate to a startling degree. You'll remember, years earlier, when most people believed that if the Ngo Dinh Diem government fell, the Americans would grow discouraged and withdraw. Un thought the opposite. He predicted that America wouldn't pull out, that instead, it would pour a massive army into the South. And exactly as he predicted, in 1965, the first American combat divisions landed. His vision had been ahead of its time. At one point, in 1971, the Saigon Army launched a major offensive into Laos, later known as Operation Lam Son 719, aimed at cutting the revolution's key supply line. It was an operation kept under tight secrecy, and yet Un had already picked up on it in advance, partly through scraps of information he had access to through his work at Time, but partly, as the story goes, through his own remarkable eye for detail. He noticed that several officers who had gone out on reconnaissance had come back with a particular kind of suntan, one only possible in a certain climate, a clue to where they had just been. From the small details other people overlooked, he pieced together a strategic picture. It was the habit of a lifetime spent observing. Time and again, he read history's next move before it happened. There was no magic in any of this. There was only one rare thing. He combined two qualities almost no one possessed together. One was the inside stream of information his position as a journalist provided. The other was a deep, genuine understanding of Americans, something he had learned during his years in California. Other people saw events. Un saw the reasons behind the events and what would come next. But here lies the bitter paradox of that success. The more successful he became, the lonelier he grew. Think about it. Every piece of praise he received as a journalist, he could never truly accept because it was praise for a cover. Every real achievement of his, the intelligence victories that shook the war, he could never tell a single soul about. He couldn't tell his American friends who he really was. He couldn't tell his Saigon colleagues the truth about himself. He couldn't even fully share it with his own family. He lived surrounded by people, always in the middle of a crowd, and yet was utterly alone. He himself once used a phrase for it that still stings. He said he was a lonely hero. And that loneliness was compounded by one more thing. His American friends were real friends. He genuinely loved them. Among them were legendary war correspondents, talented, decent people he worked alongside, shared danger with, drank coffee with every morning at Givral. They trusted him. They considered him one of their own, and every single day, he had to live with the fact that he was hiding the largest thing in his life from them. That wasn't the betrayal of a cold-blooded man. It was the tragedy of a man whose heart was simply too big for the work he carried. He didn't hate the people he was deceiving. He cared about them. And that was exactly why the weight on his shoulders never got any lighter. And there's one story that proves that affection was real enough that he was willing to take a genuine risk for it. Around 1970, a young American colleague of Un's at Time, a correspondent named Robert Sam Anson, was captured by revolutionary forces while reporting in Cambodia. For a war correspondent, falling into enemy hands in a combat zone like that usually meant a death sentence. Anson's wife, alone at the time with two very young children, was nearly out of her mind with worry. She reached out to everyone she knew in Saigon, begging anyone who could help. She came to Pham Xuan An. She had no idea and had no way of knowing that the man she was pleading with was the one person on earth actually capable of doing something about it. Because Un had a direct line to exactly the force holding her husband, and he quietly used that secret channel, the very network he had to protect with his own life, to help get his American colleague released. Think about the risk he took. Every time that secret line was activated, it was a risk of exposure. And yet he did it, not for a mission, not to gather intelligence, but simply so that a woman wouldn't have to raise her children alone, so two kids wouldn't lose their father. Anson was released, and it would be 18 years before he learned that the man who had saved his life all those years ago was Pham Xuan An. That story says everything. For Un, the front lines of war never erased the front lines of the human heart. He fought against a war, but he never once stopped seeing the people on the other side as people. There's an image he himself used to describe his own life. He said he was like a man split in two. One half was a patriotic Vietnamese, ready to sacrifice everything for his country's independence. The other half had absorbed American civilization, had come to love its values, had come to love its people, and the two halves could never merge into one. They coexisted in a single chest, tearing at each other, until his very last breath. So what kept him from breaking under that weight? What gave him the strength to keep going, year after year, playing a role where one single moment of weakness could get him killed? The answer lay in belief. Un believed in something larger than himself. He believed his people deserved to be free, to determine their own destiny, after nearly a century of having it decided for them by others. He didn't fight out of hatred. He once said something simple and cutting, that he was fighting for his country, not against Americans. To him, that was the most important distinction of all. He never dreamed of destroying America. He only dreamed of a day when Americans would go home and Vietnamese people could live in a country that was truly theirs. And that day, after so many long years, was finally drawing near. A war that had lasted for decades was about to enter its final chapter. American troops had begun withdrawing. The Saigon government was crumbling, and Pham Xuan An, the goldfish that had lain at the bottom of the sea for nearly 15 years, was about to witness the moment his entire life had been building toward. But that moment would be nothing like a simple victory. It would force him to make his final choices, choices that would reveal his true self in full. And one of those choices would leave the whole world, once they learned of it, absolutely stunned. Chapter 9. The Road Back Early, 1975. After more than 20 years of war, the balance had finally tipped for good. America, exhausted and divided, had withdrawn nearly all its combat troops. The Saigon government now had to stand on its own two legs, and those legs were shaking. The big question was no longer how the war would end. The question was how quickly. And at this decisive moment, once again, Pham Xuan An's analysis proved worth its weight in gold. Because there was one question haunting every revolutionary leader at the time. If we launch a full offensive, will the Americans come back? Would they send the bombers again? Send the fleet again? Intervene once more to save the Saigon government from collapse? This wasn't an idle question. Getting it wrong could cost tens of thousands of lives and an entire historical opportunity. Pham Xuan An, from his uniquely privileged position, had access to top-secret assessments right inside the Saigon government's own machinery, and the message he sent out was clear and unequivocal. The Americans would not come back. They were too exhausted by this war. The fleet would not be sent. The giant bombers would stay grounded. America, in essence, had let go. For the leaders weighing their final move, this was information that could change history. It was like a chess player being told, with certainty, that the strongest opponent at the board would not move. It freed them to deliver the decisive blow without fear of being struck from behind. And Un also pointed out the weak spot. According to available records, he had access to assessments showing that the enemy's most fragile defensive position lay in the Central Highlands, in a city called Buon Ma Thuot. And when the campaign began, Buon Ma Thuot was exactly where the first blow fell, throwing open the door to everything that followed. There was a smaller battle before that, at Phuc Long, treated almost as a test. Revolutionary forces took Phuc Long in early January 1975, and the whole world held its breath to see how America would respond. The answer was that they did nothing at all, exactly as Un had predicted. That was the final confirmation. The door was open. Nothing stood in the way anymore. For this contribution, Pham Xuan An was recognized once again. But by now, he had no room in his mind for medals, because the war was hurtling toward its end at a speed even the most optimistic among them hadn't expected. City after city fell. An entire front collapsed like snow in the sun. And every advancing column was converging on a single destination, Saigon. For Pham Xuan An, the final days of April 1975 carried a feeling no words can fully capture. This was the moment he had waited for nearly 20 years. The day his homeland would finally be free of foreign intervention. The day when every sacrifice, his own, Mrs. Ba's, Mrs. Kian's, his friend Tak's death at the very beginning, the dozens of comrades from the H-63 cluster who had fallen, would finally mean something. By all rights, this should have been a moment of pure joy. But for a man split in two, nothing was ever pure. Because as revolutionary forces advanced on Saigon, the city fell into chaos. Thousands tried to flee. Among them were his American friends, and among them too were Vietnamese people who had stood on the other side of the front line, people who, by any ordinary logic, Un should have considered enemies. Among those desperately trying to escape was a man whose relationship with Un was more complicated than any other. A man who had once headed the secret police, once run the anti-communist intelligence machine of Saigon, once devoted his entire career to hunting down exactly the people Un quietly served. And what Pham Xuan An was about to do for that man would become one of the most unforgettable and most difficult to understand moments of his entire life. Chapter 10. Resurrection. That man's name was Chun Kim Tuyen. For years, he had been one of the most feared men in Saigon. He ran the government's secret police apparatus, the very machine built to hunt down and eliminate spies exactly like Pham Xuan An. If anyone on Earth embodied everything Un had spent his life fighting against, it was Chun Kim Tuyen. In theory, they were sworn enemies. But human life doesn't run on theory, because over the years, Un and Tuyen had also become friends. A real friendship, born out of the years Un had spent skillfully working his way into Saigon's upper class. And now, in the final hours of a collapsing regime, Chun Kim Tuyen was being left behind. He was near the very top of the list of people who would be in danger once the new government took over. He needed to get out, and he had almost no way left to do it. And Pham Xuan An, on the very day his own side won the war, saved his enemy. He arranged to get Chun Kim Tuyen to an evacuation point in time to catch one of the last helicopters out of Saigon. He used his own connections, his own composure, on a day when the entire city was falling apart to make sure this man got out safely. Why? Why would a spy, at the exact moment of triumph, go and save the very man who had devoted his career to hunting him down? Un's answer was so simple it's almost painful. He said he didn't want to see that man's children grow up without a father. He said Tuyen was his friend, and that, in the end, they were all Vietnamese. Sit with that for a long moment, because it contains the entirety of who Pham Xuan An was. For him, the war was never about personal hatred. He wasn't fighting to get revenge on anyone. He was fighting for an idea, for his people's independence. And once that idea had become reality, he no longer saw any reason for a person, a friend, a father, to die simply for having stood on the other side. For him, once the guns fell silent, first and above all, they were all Vietnamese. The same blood, the same homeland that had already suffered far too much. This is what set Pham Xuan An apart from the cold, calculating image we imagine when we picture a spy. He wasn't an unfeeling machine. He was a man of deep compassion, compassion that reached past the front lines of the war itself. And the astonishing detail is that this act of humanity would later cost him, because not everyone on the winning side, among his own superiors, understood why he had saved an enemy like that. It would cast a shadow of suspicion over him for years. But at the time, Un wasn't thinking about the consequences for himself. He simply did what he believed was right. And then, on April 30th, 1975, the war ended. Tanks rolled in, the Saigon government surrendered, and a war that had lasted for decades finally came to a close. But for Pham Xuan An, this moment carried its own private sorrow. Because earlier, amid the chaos of evacuation, his own family, his wife and children, had been sent on a journey toward America as part of a plan to keep them safe. They were later brought back. But in those days, the man who had helped bring about this victory faced his own family's separation and uncertainty. The glory of a nation and the anxiety of a husband and father were tangled together inside the same man. And then came the part the whole world could hardly believe. The truth came out. The Time correspondent, the charming, quick-witted man from the Givrall Cafe, the close friend of so many American journalists, had, all those years, been a high-ranking communist intelligence officer. For the Western colleagues, who had worked beside him every day, this was a shock almost impossible to process. The man they had trusted, the man they'd considered one of their own, had in fact been playing a game none of them had ever imagined. You might think they would hate him, that they would feel deeply betrayed, deceived, made fools of. But here's the extraordinary part. Most of them didn't react that way at all. The story of how his American friends received the truth and how Pham Xuan An himself spent the rest of his life caught between two worlds that could never fully reconcile inside him, is one of the most moving parts of this entire story. And it raises the biggest question of all, a question that perhaps no one, not even he himself, could ever fully answer. Who was this man, in the end? A hero? A traitor? Or something more complicated than either? Something we still don't quite have the words for. Chapter 11. Return with the elixir. The war was won. The country was reunified. For a man who had sacrificed nearly his entire life for this day, you might think the rest of his story would be a chain of glory and ease. That wasn't the case. In the years after the war, Pham Xuan An found himself in a strange and lonely new position. The very man who had once been so intimately close to Americans, who had lived inside American life, who had just saved a former secret police chief, was now viewed with a certain wariness. He knew too much about the other world. He thought in a way too different from those around him. Some felt he thought too much like an American. In 1978, he was sent north to study at a political institute for about 10 months. Un, with his usual bluntness and touch of humor, didn't like calling it re-education. In his own words, he said he had to go because he didn't know anything about the theories they wanted him to study, and that he already knew too many other things to really change. That's how a man free in his own mind faced his circumstances. Not bitterly, not broken, just a knowing smile at the irony of his own fate. But whatever the circumstances, his contributions were ultimately recognized at the highest level. He was awarded the title of Hero of the People's Armed Forces. He was later promoted to the rank of Major General. He received numerous combat achievement medals for contributions stretching from Ap Bac all the way to the final campaign of 1975. On paper, he was one of the most honored spies his entire nation ever produced. But Un himself never claimed the glory as his own. He always said he was only a very small link in the chain. He once said something worth sitting with, that a piece of intelligence, no matter how accurate, is only ever half its own value. The other half lies in the analysis and decisions of the people above him. And he never forgot the people who had carried him to that point. After liberation, he was reunited with Mrs. Ba, the courier who had spent 15 years quietly carrying his documents through untold danger. And their reunion wasn't full of formal words. It was as simple and warm as family. It said Mrs. Ba teasingly scolded him, saying that back then he'd lived too extravagantly, the German Shepherd, the expensive motorbike, and it had made her sick with worry that he was drawing too much attention to himself. Un just took her hand and told her that whatever he had achieved, a large part of it belonged to her. Hold on to that image, a famous general of intelligence, holding the hand of an illiterate countrywoman, telling her that this glory belongs to both of them, because he understood, better than anyone, that without quiet people like her, there would never have been a Pham Xuan An at all. And what about his American friends? The ones he had deceived for all those years? This is the part where the story touches something deeply human, because most of them never turned their backs on him. There was a well-known American journalist who had worked in Vietnam, who later looked back and spoke about Un in words worth reflecting on. He said he still cared for Un. He said he never felt betrayed, because Un had had to act as a Vietnamese man in a tragic period of his country's history. Think about the generosity in that statement. That man understood enough to see that, in Un's position, a patriotic Vietnamese might have had no other choice at all. One of Un's former editors at Time, upon learning the truth, didn't grow angry either. He said it was Un's country, and that if the circumstances were reversed, he himself might have done the same thing. And then, in a gesture that warms the heart, that same former editor later helped raise money so that Un's son could study in America. Stop and sit with that. The spy who had spent his whole life deceiving these Americans, and yet, when it was all over, they were the ones who reached out to help his child. That isn't the behavior of enemies. That's the behavior of people who, even standing on opposite sides of a war, still held on to their respect for one another. An American television journalist visited him years after the war and asked him about the double truth of who he was. Un just smiled and answered in a way that was entirely him. He said one truth was that he had been a correspondent for Time magazine, and another truth was that he had joined the resistance from its earliest years, Both were true. Neither was a lie. They simply coexisted, both at once, inside one man. That's perhaps the fullest confession of his entire life. He never denied the love he felt for America and his American friends. He never regretted having served his own country. He carried both until the end of his life, like a man carrying two wounds that never fully healed, but that he never once tried to disown. That paradox followed him even into his final years, sometimes in ways both small and bitter. In 1997, he was invited to a conference in America, a chance to return to the very land of his youth that he had once loved, but he wasn't allowed to go. With his usual composure, he simply remarked that people didn't understand him, and so they feared him. An entire life spent living between two worlds, and in the end, both sides still looked at him with a measure of doubt, simply because he was a man who could never be neatly filed under either one. But he never let that make him bitter. He kept the same character that had defined him since childhood. He still kept birds, still kept fish, still held on to his fascination with the natural world. There's a detail that's almost comic. In 2004, he kept a hunting bird at home, and that very bird pecked his hand, making him miss a farewell party for the American ambassador. The spy who had once outwitted an entire superpower was, in the end, bested by his own pet bird. He told the story with a laugh, because humor, right up to the very end, was always his way of embracing life. It's said he lived by three principles he often repeated, and he liked to say them in English, the language he had learned all those years ago in California. Help others, live honestly, and never lie. Sit with that last one for a moment. Never lie. Coming from a man who had spent nearly his entire life living in deception, it sounds like the greatest contradiction imaginable. But if you understand him, you'll see it isn't a contradiction at all. Because to the people who truly mattered, to his friends, to his own conscience, to his ideals, he never once lied. His deception served exactly one purpose, and he never let it corrode the man underneath. His extraordinary story was later told most fully in a book by an American scholar, Larry Berman, titled Perfect Spy. Berman spent years on the project, making countless flights back and forth across the ocean, sitting through hundreds of hours of conversation with Un himself to piece his life together. And even after all that time, Berman admitted something. He said Pham Xuan An had carried a great many of his intelligence secrets with him to the other side. This man, to the very end, kept a part of himself hidden that no one ever managed to reach. True to his own name, Un, hidden, never fully revealed. There was one moment in 2006 that closed this story in a way almost too perfect to have been written into a novel. Pham Xuan An's son, the same young man who had once been helped through his education by his father's American friends, had grown up to become a diplomat. And that year, when the President of the United States visited Vietnam, that very son was present as the interpreter for the meeting between the two heads of state. The son of a spy who had once fought against America now stood as the bridge of language between Vietnam and America in peacetime. The son later said that, in that moment, all he could wish was that his father were still alive to see it, because that same year, 2006, Pham Xuan An passed away. He died on September 20th, 2006, in Ho Chi Minh City, at the age of 79. He had smoked for nearly his entire life, and near the end he spoke of it in the same calm voice as always, saying he had smoked for decades, and now it was time to pay the price. One of his old comrades, the cluster commander who had once shielded him, sent him off with a line of poetry that played on his own name, that Xuan An had truly gone into hiding now, and his friends would grieve for him without end. A name that had shaped an entire life, right down to its final act, still shaping even his own death. So how should we remember Pham Xuan An? Some will call him a master spy, one of the greatest intelligence officers of the 20th century, a man who outwitted an entire superpower for nearly 15 years without ever being caught. That's true. Some will remember him as a patriot, a man who sacrificed his own peace of mind so that his country could be free. That's true too. But perhaps the deepest truth about Pham Xuan An lies in the very paradox he never escaped, and never wanted to escape. He was a man who loved two countries. He believed in the cause of his own people, but he never let that belief curdle into hatred for the people on the other side. He fought for one side, but his heart was large enough to still love the other. In a war that split the whole world into us and them, he still managed to hold on to something almost no one else did. He held on to his humanity, and perhaps that is his true legacy. Not the secret documents, not the victories, not the medals, but the reminder that even in history's darkest hours, when people are forced to choose sides and take up arms against one another, some people still refuse to let war kill the humanity inside them. A spy can be perfect at his trade, but what makes people remember Pham Xuan An isn't that perfection. It's the very human, very contradictory, very imperfect part of him hidden beneath that perfect shell. This is the story of the perfect spy, a man who carried two worlds inside one chest and never betrayed either one. If this story moved you, know that it's only one of countless untold stories from this war. People, strategies, sacrifices most of the world has never heard of. On the Vietnam Untold channel, we go looking for exactly these stories, telling history from a side the familiar documentaries usually leave out. If you want to keep making this journey with us, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next story. Because history always has two sides, and half of it, to this day, still hasn't been told.